Cutting Edge with Albert Burke. The Narcissus Caper, Part 2.
Your most dangerous enemy, one no American before you had to face as you do now, is at work here, but not in what you see here. This is Chinese communist power. The men who control it are dangerous enemies, and the soundtrack on this film makes very clear you are the main target of this power if and when the Chinese decide to use it. The enemy that threatens you as never before in our history is here and is your most dangerous enemy because it is just as dangerous to these people because of what it has done to these people. It's an old enemy for the Chinese. They faced it before. They've been destroyed by it, and this kind of power was no defense against it. That enemy is not in what you see here. It is in what you cannot see here, in what is happening here to a few young people who are in very serious trouble. In this place, those few young people hold much of your life and much of the future of these United States in their hands. What happens to them in places like this around today's communist China will decide how much of your life will be spent in peace or in war, and will decide whether this China will be a leading nation or the leading nation. All that depends upon what happens to those few young people in these places who are in serious trouble because they daydream. There's not much room in today's China for daydreamers. Chinese schools are set up to turn out trained men and women, trained to build bridges and dams, trained to make steel, build roads and missiles and hydrogen bombs. Trained, in other words, to do the practical things that must be done if China is to catch up with the great powers, then be one. And daydreamers thinking about offbeat, impractical things are no help in that routine. If those minds cannot be made to do practical work, which will mean quick and useful results, they'll be a loss to communist China. So China's daydreamers are in trouble in Chinese schools now, and what happens to them will make things happen to you. Because if the men who have the power in China do not change the offbeat, abstract, impractical thinking of its young daydreamers now, if those young minds do not give in to the pressure put on them to do what the men who run China call useful work, then China may one day turn out men like these, the daydreamers in our history, in the United States and in Europe, the offbeat, abstract, impractical thinkers who changed the world with their ideas about electricity and internal combustion engines and telephones and rockets and atomic energy, the ideas that mean power and leadership for the nation or the people with such minds which are developed and not corrected or suppressed. Those world changers began with daydreams. If the men who run things in China do change the thinking of their young oddballs, then China may one day turn out a report like this one, which is dated 1963, which tells about what happens to a nation in which men with power to run things do succeed in correcting their oddballs. The very unhappy thing about this report, though, is that it was not put out by a communist China where daydreamers are in trouble. This report was put out in the United States, whereas the facts here make clear our daydreamers haven't been doing too well either. The title of this report explains why you face an enemy more dangerous than any Americans before you had to face, and the title here is Crisis in Creative Thought. And the enemy responsible for this report, who is amongst us now, is that most dangerous enemy there. That one, a man who one day long ago wanted to be king, but did not want the responsibilities that went with the power of a king. The man is King Lear. And a few hundred years ago, one of the greatest plays ever written was written about him because he was a dangerous man, and he still is, as we will see in this part 2 of the Narcissus Caper. This was not just another bombing mission late in 1943. British and American planes were out on this one to destroy 63 targets on the coast of France and Germany. Special targets, something big was involved. We learned about them from the Polish underground, from Polish agents among the slave laborers who had helped build some strange military bases along the German-held coast. Earlier in May, acting on that tip, a British reconnaissance plane flew over one of those bases when this happened. And it flew back with photographs of something new in war, which the men with power who ran things in America and Britain had called science fiction stuff, offbeat, impractical, until one day, it was September 8, 1944, the first of more than 1,000 of these landed in London, killing 43 people. Then suddenly the offbeat became very practical when that Vergeltungswaffe 2 there, traveling more than a mile a second, moving out of range of any weapons the Allies had, 70 miles up, changed war, changed the world, changed your life. That V-2 rocket developed by the Germans shook things up a bit, and not just where they exploded on their targets. There were some particularly shook up people in that place in Washington, D.C. when that first German rocket landed in London. And one of the first things those men did there was to set up technical intelligence teams, which were then attached to every military unit headed for those special military bases where the V-2 rockets were being built. And at that point, those men were very interested in what creative minds had done over in Germany to make an offbeat idea into a new basis for war, as only a bit more than a year before that Polish underground tip came through, those same men had smiled politely while telling one of our top creative minds that they could see no practical use for his idea that these things could be made into a new basis for war. That man was Dr. Robert Goddard, who on March 16, 1926, carried off an experiment that was at least as important as the first flight of the airplane made by the Wright brothers. On a farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, Dr. Goddard set off a rocket that went up 184 feet, but using liquid oxygen and gasoline in turbine-driven pumps, and that kind of rocket was our first step into space. But as many of Goddard's neighbors at the time made quite clear, it was just another offbeat, impractical, crackpot idea by a man who was disturbing things for no good reason they could see. And what Americans in Massachusetts could not see in 1926, men with the power to run things in the early years of World War II could not see either. We entered the space age not following the lead of one of America's top creative minds, who as far back as 1919 had made clear that a rocket to the moon was technically possible. We entered the space age following 300 boxcar loads of parts for some 100 German V-2 rockets, which we shipped to the United States, along with most of the top German rocket experts who had escaped from the Peenemünde rocket base before the Russians got there. We entered the space age after building and firing some 70 rockets made of those German parts at our proving grounds in White Sands, New Mexico, and after pumping the German rocket experts for all the information they could give us. And out of that, at the end of World War II came one of the most ironic and dangerous stories in all of America's history, when at one point, while we were questioning one of the top German rocket men we had brought to America, he asked the Americans why they were questioning him about rocket matters. "Why don't you ask your own rocket pioneer, Dr. Goddard?" that German wanted to know. We in Germany learned what we know by studying him. And that is a terribly dangerous story. Because somehow, for some reason, there was not the imagination among the men with the power that ran this country to understand what an American named Goddard offered them as the basis for a new age. Impractical was their word for Goddard's ideas. Those men with the power that ran this country then did not lead us into the space age using the creative talent we had in Goddard and in others. We were pushed into the space age by what an enemy's creative talent forced us to do. And that is a dangerous story. because nations do not grow great and stay great by that routine, following somebody else's lead. The point is that was not the routine Americans before us followed to make the United States the leading nation on earth. Americans followed no one in dreaming up and supporting the ideas that made this country the most inventive on earth when such things as the electric light came along. Edison worked out the best of these during the time when other inventors were working on or had turned out the telephone, the telegraph, the rotary printing press, following earlier inventions like the cotton gin and the reaper, and later ones like the submarine, then the airplane. New ideas poured out of creative American minds once, as they are not coming out now in our time. Edison and the Americans of his time from about the 1830s to 1917 lived in the age of American inventive genius, when we were not pushed by the creative minds of other peoples and other nations to see the value of new ideas. But that age ended for us in 1917, when the number of patents for new ideas dreamed up by Americans began going down as the size of our population went up. Today, our patent office is licensing about half as many new ideas by Americans per capita as were licensed in 1917. And this at a time when science and technology have opened new worlds of ideas to work with, to do new things in new ways, to make new things. The point in all this is that something has happened to America to explain that very dangerous story. The story of this report about a crisis in creative thought in this winter 1963 issue of the magazine of the American Petroleum Institute, which points out that today's America is turning out fewer and fewer inventive minds than we did in an earlier America. And the reason for that story is tied to a little-known, much-ignored story about what has happened to America since that man got here back in the year 1889. That man and his story is the main reason why you face an enemy more dangerous to this country now than any American before you had to face. Well, his story and that enemy in a moment. Oscar Asmussen did it for you in this room back in June 1889. He made America a greater nation that day when he told off some immigration officials in this place who had decided against letting one of those people just arrive from Germany into the United States. That immigrant was a wanted man in Germany, guilty of political crimes against his country. He arrived here without money, unable to speak English, and with no prospect for a job. He was a very poor risk, the immigration people decided. They told him he would be deported on the next ship. Oscar Asmussen changed that decision, and a lot of history for Americans, when he told those immigration officials that Karl August Rudolf Steinmetz was really a very rich, famous, and wealthy German scientist, and that he, Asmussen, was his banker. After that incident in the immigration offices of New York's port of entry in 1889, Asmussen drops out of American history, but Steinmetz makes American history, because that day in 1889, one of the most creative minds ever to work in America barely made it into this country. And he made history mainly because of the man who was the president of this place, the General Electric Company, which is the great and powerful company it is in our time, because that president had the imagination to see in Steinmetz's ideas the basis for a new age. For 30 years, Steinmetz was the creative spark plug that moved General Electric. He was not an experimental man like an Edison. He worked with his mind, put his ideas into books and into plans. And out of those plans came today's electrically powered America. It's quite a story, with quite an interesting twist in our time, told by one of the editors of this magazine, Fortune magazine, several years ago. While that editor was working on a series of articles about the modern American business corporation, just so happened that one of them was today's General Electric Company. And at one point, while gathering information, he sat in on a training session for young future executives of that company. That session was about the kind of person who would do the work of that corporation best today And at one point, this visiting editor was moved by what he heard to ask those young men what they would do about another Steinmetz if they were in President Rice's place when back in the 1890s, that head of General Electric bought out an entire company for which Steinmetz worked at the time just in order to get him to come to General Electric. Well, in the answers to that question by those young men in training to be future executives of that company right into the President's office, in their answers is your most dangerous enemy today, unlike any Americans before you had to face, because several of those trainees stated flatly that they would not want a Steinmetz around today, and one of them put his feeling into these words: "I don't think we would put up with a fellow like that now," unquote. Others among that group weren't quite as hard on job prospects for Dr. Steinmetz in the General Electric company they would run, when after some discussion and argument they thought it might be possible to iron out what they described as his rough spots by just the kind of training program they were in. After that training, they were quite sure that a Steinmetz would fit in better, would be less antisocial. Well, Steinmetz was antisocial. He had one of the most creative, disruptive, brilliant, and difficult minds this nation has ever known. He did not take orders well. He was strong-minded, strong-willed. He was a dreamer, a thinker who often wanted to be left alone. And physically, he was a hunchback. He did not have the approved executive look that can be seen in any city or university or executives club these days. Steinmetz had just about all the qualities that would keep him out of most corporate enterprises in our America, if that decision were left in the hands of the kind of men who are in more and more executive spots in most corporate enterprises today. You see, back in the 1890s, about two-thirds of the kind of men who ran that America's business and industry had once also run their own private enterprises. And when they became executives in corporations they did not own, they still carried over into their new jobs many of the habits and ways of doing things they'd known. President Rice of General Electric in the 1890s was naturally interested in new ideas and in men who had new ideas in order to put out new and better products which would give his company the edge over its competitors for customers. That was the American way of doing things a very long yesterday ago, because in 1950, less than 1 of every 10 of these men in top jobs of American corporations, that is, men running American business and industry, less than 1 in 10 had any kind of experience with their own private enterprises, and most of them knew nothing of the ways of doing things in a private enterprise America that had made this country the leading inventive country on earth in the last century. There was a close tie between a private enterprise America and a highly inventive America yesterday. Today's America is not that kind of place, and the facts to prove it are in this report. And this report has much to do with the fact that practically all of today's top men in American business are paid employees, paid by stockholders to run the companies in which the stockholders have invested their money. By the record, few of those men with that power that runs today's business and industry believe in the idea of competition as it had been a part of the American way of doing things yesterday. Consider this: in the month of August 1965 alone, the steel industry and the electrical industry of this country were both found guilty in the courts of actions to avoid competition through price fixings with fines that ran into the millions of dollars. Very few of today's top men in American business are as interested in new ideas for new products as they are in their fourth quarterly reports, which tell the stockholders how well they've been running the company. Well, their jobs depend on those reports. But very few such men with the power that ran things in this country could see in a Robert Goddard's offbeat ideas in the 1940s what earlier Americans with that same power, like a Rice of General Electric, saw at once in Steinmetz's offbeat ideas in the 1890s. Goddard was an impractical dreamer to American men of power in our time, but Steinmetz was understood at once by the men of power in yesterday's very different America. and different in the way that fellow was worried we would be different. Back in the year 1787, while Americans were trying to set up this nation in writing a constitution, and that year Madison, who was to be our fourth president, wrote in the Federalist Papers that he could see great problems ahead for this nation because of what he described as the future connection between the great capitalists in manufactures and commerce and in the numbers to be employed by them. That connection would bring about great changes in this nation, he writes here. Intellectual changes, moral changes, social changes, to which the laws and the institutions of this country must be adapted. And to do this, Mr. Madison says in the Federalist Papers, to do this will require all the wisdom of the wisest patriots. Unquote, Mr. Madison. The changes Mr. Madison wrote and worried about in 1787 had to do with power. Who would have it? What would they do with it? And what could be done to keep whoever had power from misusing it? Now, he was not alone in this. His friends were with him in 1787 in Philadelphia, hammering out a constitution that would keep men from using political power badly. But he was pretty much alone in warning that economic power could be used badly too, and he was right. This report, A Crisis in Creative Thought in Our Time, is the result of economic power used badly and dangerously. When you add to it this little item from our National Science Foundation, which says that between the years of 1946 and 1961, 45,523 scientists and engineers came into this country as immigrants. Those foreign-trained people, it says here, have helped to make up our shortages of our own trained people for our space programs. Check the names of the people in our space programs. In our medical schools and hospitals, check many of the names in our medical schools and hospitals. In our atomic energy research, check the names there. Somehow, for some reason, this routine goes on. Now, what goes on here? Well, what goes on begins here, in today's General Electric or United States Steel or any other large American corporation, which today employs great numbers, just as Madison predicted. And these big corporations have as their biggest job just working. Paychecks have to go out every week. Bills have to be paid. Work norms have to be filled. Raw materials brought in, products shipped out. And the main job of the men who run these places is to see that they run as smoothly and as efficiently and as profitably as possible, because there are stockholders behind all this waiting for dividends. The men who run those places want as few interruptions in their routine as is possible, as few conflicts, as few stresses or strains or other problems as possible. And to make that possible, they look for the kind of person to work in those places who fits in easily, has no rough spots, has the right kind of personality, knows how to get along with people. And the words that are used to describe that kind of person are, I quote, the person who is in harmony with the corporate environment, unquote. Important words because they just about eliminate every creative mind around. They do because creative minds are always disruptive minds. They change things with new ideas. They question things, they dispute, they criticize. They are not harmonious minds. They are suspect, they are resented by the executive whose main purpose is to see that his department or his company works as smoothly as possible. Exactly as those young trainees in that program for future top jobs with today's General Electric company did not want another Steinmetz around. The man who more than any other single person made the company they hoped to run one day possible. He would not fit in, was their complaint. Harmony and quiet efficiency in a smoothly working organization was their goal. And be assured that that message has gotten around. When I taught at the university through the 1950s, my students had gotten the message. The Steinmetz and the Goddard routines were not for them. And behind that message is this report about shortages of inventive minds, this crisis in creative thought. Now, Who is responsible for that message? The wisest patriots? In a moment. Part one of this series, the Narcissus caper, we said there was a mystery behind that wall. Why the Chinese, one of the most inventive people on earth, did not turn their inventions into the kind of modern power in war and peace that would have made them a leading world power into our time. The answer to that mystery is the goal of the small group of men who ran China through most of Chinese history. The order of the learned, they were called, the men with the power that ran China. They decided that what was best for China was harmony and quiet in a smoothly working nation that would be upset by as few problems, changes, or stresses as possible. They stifled their creative minds, they corrected the thinking of their daydreamers, they made them fit in, and they kept China's inventions from changing things. They were completely successful in their work. When one day people in the world around China who were not interested in harmony or quiet put their creative minds to work changing things in war and in peace and destroyed their China. And in that is the story of King Lear next time.